And by the way, this not to get at boomers, and I know not all boomers do this, but boomer generation generally, I mean, I do have some sympathy for millennials. I know a lot of people mock the millennial generation for a lot of traits, which are mockable. I get it. But the boomers, man, they kicked the can and it landed squarely on the head of millennials. like, and they're like, what's wrong? Give me my Social Security check. And it's like, well, you jerk. You voted for Social Security. You spent all the money on other services because the system's basically bankrupt. You got to tax other people. Like, they spent so much time voting for borrowing money and kicking the can down the road. And now they're all aging and they're like, why are our drugs so expensive? And how dare you try and stop Social Security? We paid into it. Yeah. Well, try being 30. You've been paying, if you're 30 and you've been working for 10 years, you've paid 10 years into Social Security. You will never, ever see a dime of Social Security ever.
What years and what politicians, maybe you don't know, but you're talking about like the boomers, but what administrations, when did all this massive borrowing
Well, they're all
start
pretty
happening?
bad. But now I'm going to I will commit suicide for the conservatives, right? Or with, I'll get myself in trouble. This is a crime. Reagan. I mean, Reagan was horrible. And in fairness, the president actually can't pass a budget. The Congress has to. But, if you look at prior to, this is, by the way, these numbers aren't exact. It's just based on my recollection because I didn't prep for this discussion. Prior to 1980, roughly, and maybe even early 80s, the U.S. was by far the largest credit nation. We were owed money by people. You fast
Right.
forward 10, 15 years, maybe 20 years. I don't know how long it took, but we became the largest debtor nation overnight. And what happened was conservatives speak a braggadocious game about, well, we want to cut taxes and limit spending. And they do. They get in and they cut taxes, but what they don't do is limit spending. So they get in, they cut taxes, and then they just borrow in print, usually borrow. So they talk out of both sides of their mouth, and they never actually reduce spending. And you can see, and look, it's hard in the face of the media because if you cut, let's say you were supposed to have a department that was supposed to increase 5% in budget from year over year, and instead they're going to increase 4%. It's still an increase. Papers like the New York Times and Washington Post and all the mainstream media will run around going, it's a 1% cut. Right? When it's like, it's a 4% increase. It's just not as much of an increase as they wanted. Right? It's like,
Right.
so you've got an entire mainstream media that's running around like, chickens with their heads cut off at anyone who dares maybe sorta don't increase as fast as we planned. I mean, it would be if an administration got in and actually cut programs, I think people would be committing seppuku on the streets and tearing out
They
their
would
hair
lose
and like,
their
yeah,
minds. But what if somebody was able to articulate this the way you have, that like the way that you talk about how borrowing from future generations is immoral, and we need to
right,
cut programs and we need to cut spending in
right,
order to try and alleviate some of that debt we've created for our kids and our grandkids and great grandkids. What if
yeah.
you does no one I'm not that familiar with the right. Has no one on the right made this
I mean,
argument
people.
in an emotional way?
I think people make the arguments, but spending is like cocaine. Peter Schiff has an excellent analogy he talks about. I think it's cocaine that he uses, but it might be heroin. Doesn't matter. I think it's coke. But Peter Schiff is great for this kind of stuff. It's like cocaine. You take a little bit of it, and you feel great, and then your high comes down, and you have a choice to make. You either pay for the party you just had, which is tough, or you take more coke. And the nature of the beast of the government and the populace that controls the government is to take more coke. So we are just on a
Well,
binge, and eventually we'll die. That's what will happen.
somebody in the chat, this was not a super chat, but I just saw it scroll by. Somebody mentioned Ron Paul. And that's what I was thinking of. Ron Paul's someone who's
Sure. Probably the best politician in the last 100 years. Didn't get far. I mean, he was in Congress, he talked about it, but he's treated as a kook by the mainstream media almost his entire career. They tried to dig up any kind of stuff they could in his past constantly to malign him. And when he brings up things like end the Fed during debates, no moderator wants to talk, but they just switch the subject. No one wants to talk. He's viewed as a crazy loon.
they're not interested in it.
No, and his son Rand Paul, I think, has mentioned like auditing the Fed once, and like, but they're considered jokes. They're considered crazy kooks by the mainstream, precisely because they want to talk about the Federal Reserve and its stranglehold on the U.S. and and they want to talk about responsible economics. And no politician, no one in the deep state, no one in the military-industrial complex, and no politician by default ever wants to change the way things are going, because they're hoping to be dead before the party ends. So what are you doing raining on their parade? Stop telling them that they can't spend money, because spending money is how you get votes. You promise shit to people. You promise free education. You promise student loan forgiveness. You promise free healthcare. You promise this. You promise that. That's how you get elected. One of the reasons democracy sucks. That's how you get elected.
That's one of the things about this Biden promise to, erase, I put that in quotes because he's not erasing it, erase student debt, is that a few years ago, I don't think, when I was squarely in the social justice left, I wouldn't have been able to identify that as the craven tactic that it is to try and buy votes.
Mm-hmm.
I would have viewed it the way a lot of leftists view it, which is just very surface level about intent. It's like the virtue signaling empathy thing. Like, oh, of course people shouldn't have to struggle to repay student debt. Of course, that's the kind thing to do. And not look below the surface to see, that they view it. That's why I think we have to get better at making the moral arguments, because the people who support bad ideas like this, they're doing it on a very shallow, the facts don't support what they're saying, but they are winning in the moral war. They're
winning in the emotional war.
The emotional war. They're only making the moral argument. We should, don't you care about people? We should erase the debt. It's immoral to make people repay this debt. And I think we have to get better at pointing out, like what you're talking about, that no, it's immoral to burden our kids and grandkids and, society's future generations with this kind of debt.
It's totally immoral.
So,
I mean, and it's, complain all you want about the meat grinder that was Vietnam, but I bet if you could actually calculate the amount of damage the government's done through the expansion of the money supply and borrowing money, I bet it's killed more people. I mean, I'll bet it's killed more people because your life expectancy and your life expectancy is related to your standard of living, which is related to the economic health of a nation. So the amount of damage that's been done is incalculable. I mean, we don't know. We don't know what could have happened.
Yeah.
But I'm hoping actually that millennials, maybe I'm wrong, but maybe some millennials will be, and or Gen Z, who probably have it worse than millennials.
Gen Z
will come along and realize, like, this is a whole, like, these old jerks they've been living on borrowed time and they don't care, and they're leaving us with the bill. They partied their entire lives, and then they turn around and have the gall to tell us, well, all you got to do is work hard. It's the land of opportunity. Here, kid, here's the bill. Bye. It's like, well, you didn't pay the bill. You lived on your grandkids' livelihood. That's what sustained you, and you voted for all this crap pretending that you could afford it. It's like they literally took out credit cards, lived their entire lives, and handed the credit card bill to their grandkids. and then had
Yeah,
the gall to say to their grandkids, "Well, when I was young, I just worked hard and there's opportunity." And it's like, all right, well, F you, Grandpa. Right?
yeah,
So that's what
it's
this
like your
older generations have done to people.
it's like your cocaine party analogy. They just kept the party going their whole
Totally.
life. The cocaine party took out a bunch of credit card debt,
Hmm.
and then, like you said, they want to die before the bill comes, and then just die and give all the debt from the cocaine parties to their grandkids.
Right. And they're horrified, and everyone's Republicans and Democrats alike are afraid of the older voters, right? Because the older voters have this like unearned like moral indignation if anyone suggests, "Hey, maybe we should cut social security." How dare you? How dare you cut my social security? Ah! It's like, well, I mean, look, dude, you snorted it in the 80s. It's over. You snorted your retirement in the 80s. It's done. You don't deserve it. I don't care how much you paid in. I mean, obviously on an individual level, that's not true. But as a
On the
as a
individual level,
as a class of people, like they snorted their retirement in the 80s. It's over. It's done. And the 90s, they just continued to vote for this crap. So if you love your grandkids, you don't do this.
well, on that note,
And someone says it
can we
predates the
go?
boomers. That is exactly true. I am saying boomers. It predates the boomers. And it postdates the boomers. It is not only the boomers.